Andy, a question my friend has asked me is that given the history of the church and the legacy of that history, why should I take Christianity seriously?
Do you know, Alan, it's a hugely important question, and one I often hear. And when I hear someone ask it, the first thing I want to do is actually begin by affirming the question and saying I can understand why somebody asks it, because you don't have to look that long through history to see there are lots of examples of where the church has behaved appallingly. Perhaps one of the worst examples, and one that often people bring up, is on the 15th of July, 1099. That was the date when the Crusader armies that had been besieging Jerusalem finally broke through the city walls, rushed to the Temple Mount area, where hundreds, even thousands of men, women and children had been sheltering from the besieging armies. The Crusaders broke into that area of the city and slaughtered everybody, not just fighting aged men. They killed old people, they killed women, they killed children. Chroniclers from the time talk about the blood, rising up to the ankles of the horses. Then the Crusaders decided, after having done that, they would march to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the most sacred sites in Christianity. That's the church built over the traditional site of Jesus' burial, the Garden Tomb, and they held a worship service to give thanks to God for what had just happened. And I read that as a committed Christian, and I want to weep that that was done in the name of Jesus. Now, if those were the only examples in history, we'd have a huge problem. But there's a flip side too. There are numerous examples in history of where the church has behaved beautifully and wonderfully and incredibly. The reason we have things like universities and hospitals today goes back to the work of Christians. Or you look at things like one of my great heroes, Martin Luther King. The sort of father of the civil rights movement. King was a committed Christian. If you go and listen to his famous I Have a Dream speech, he quotes the Bible on numerous occasions. He was committed to the non-violent message of Jesus, even when he was beaten up, even when his house was firebombed and his followers wanted to take up arms against their oppressors. Luther King always brought it back to Jesus and said, no, we must love our enemies. We must pray for those who persecute us, because that's what Jesus commanded, and it's in his name that we do these things. And because of the King and those working with him and following that example of Jesus, they changed history. And the reason we live in a world where we have civil rights today, no matter your background or your race, is because of a Christian leader like him. And so you have this mixed picture, times when the church behaved well, times when the church behaved badly. And that mixed picture is true for atheism too, interestingly enough. We can look through history and find times when atheists behaved with incredible humanitarian compassion, but we can also look through history and find atrocities. Our skeptical friends sometimes like to bring up the Spanish Inquisition. Well, the Spanish Inquisition killed 6,000 people over 350 years. Compare that to the French Revolution, which was secular. That killed 18,000 people in 6 months. Or Joseph Stalin, committed atheist leader of Russia. He killed 20 million people in 30 years. That's 2 Spanish Inquisitions a week for 30 years. We have a mixed picture. So those mixed pictures raise the question, Alan, how do we decide? How do we look at the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades and say that's bad? Or we look at Martin Luther King and say that's good? How do we look at atheist humanitarians and go they're good? Or we look at Joseph Stalin and say bad? What is the criteria that we're using? And for Christians, the criteria is very simple. It's Jesus Christ. If somebody says they are a Christian, then we mustn't just look at their actions, we must look at their actions and go, how does that measure up to the standard of Jesus, the one who said, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, the one who did no violence himself, but had violence done to him, and even while he was hanging on the cross, said to those around, forgive those who've done this to me. He prayed from the cross, Father, forgive them who are killing me, they do not know what they're doing. So what do we make of all of this? Well, our friends at the Centre for Public Christianity in Australia did a wonderful documentary last year called For the Love of God, which digs into these issues in more detail. And they use a beautiful illustration there that I want to end with. They say, consider a beautiful piece of music. Consider perhaps one of Elgar's cello concertos. Now, you or I could go and grab a cello from a second-hand music shop here in the city. We don't play that instrument. We would absolutely mangle that piece of music. Or we could hire one of the world's greatest cellists and ask them to come to a concert hall here and play that piece of music for us. How would you determine what Elgar's cello concerto, whatever, should actually sound like? Well, you can't judge it by a poor performance. You need to judge it by the best performance. And it's the same with the church. We need to look at what the church and Christians have done in history, compare it to the standard of Christ, and when people fall short, we call them out. But when people like Luther King and others measure up to Jesus, we should point them out. But don't stop there. Look to the one to whom Luther King and others pointed, Jesus, the one in whose name they did all this. He's the standard, and he's the one we need to look to.